All right. Well, looks like people are starting to filter in here, so let's maybe give that another minute and
Sure,
get started.
sure.
Yeah.
This Zoom thing really works well. Now I have a profile photo, so when I blank my screen to share my desktop tonight, you won't just see an outline. You'll actually see a picture of me as I'm talking. So I learned how to do that. I have more slides than last week because there's more information. And I won't bore anybody with a poem again tonight, like last time. And I have some pictures of the drone and things of what we did up at the bridge today.
All right.
Very interesting up there today. We arrived at, I arrived at a little before 6 or a little before 7. A little before 7, stayed till about 4:30. So 3 people from Milwaukee were up.
It's nice of them to do that. It's very cool. All right, let's get started here. Let's a little technical snafu here. There we go. My name is Howard Rakes. I'm the Information Services Coordinator at the Chippewa Falls Public Library. I'm happy to introduce Chuck Nagel tonight. Chuck is the founder of the Cobban Bridge Preservation, Inc., a local nonprofit organization with a plan to relocate one span of the existing structure to a nearby roadside park. He has written a small book on the bridge history, including its relocation from now Lake Wissota, and a new edition is in progress. So with that, here is Chuck.
Well, welcome everyone. I appreciate you returning for a second session. I recognize the names of those of having been here last week. Let me share my my screen so I can bring up my slides. And as last week, feel free to unmute or whatever you need to do to ask questions along the way. It's intended to be informational, so I'd be happy to address any and all questions or comments along the way. Let me see if I can make this happen here. It'll just take a minute here. I have many more slides to share tonight, so I have to click on all of these for some reason to queue them up. Just another few seconds. I guess that was more than a few seconds, wasn't it? But we're just about done. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, great. So last week we talked about the orphan bridge that Cobban adopted and how it arrived at Cobban from now Lake Wissota. Tonight, same title, but how it departed. But first, just a couple of pictures of this historic monument that we have here in Chippewa Valley. One of the best pictures I've ever seen of the bridge and the corn fields behind. This was taken by a drone, not us, but a local drone photographer. The way the bridge looks today, I mean, some years ago, but the decking is the way it looks today. This is the way it looked many, many years ago with steel tread plate to drive on, which howled with the tires driving over it. So the effort to save the bridge, the beginnings. Chippewa County decided they needed a new crossing of the Chippewa River. And a good number of years went by using a engineering consulting firm to study and find the best location to cross the river. They ran up a bill of about $500,000 over almost 9 years, studying, investigating, researching, and public sessions. I attended a few of those, and in 2018, there was a session in the lower level of the Chippewa County Highway Department building on Grand Avenue, across from the senior center, if you will. And people kept asking the question, why can't we keep the old bridge and use it as a bike trail, walking across the river, etc.? And in essence, not a quote, but in essence, one of the speakers said, read my lips. This old bridge is going away. We'll come back with this concept of replace in kind, meaning we're going to replace it in the same location. I don't know what happened to this slide, but what it was a quote from Bruce Stelzer, the Chippewa County Highway Commissioner in 1991. And he said, this is from the Chippewa Herald Telegram newspaper at that time, I am sure the bridge will not be dismantled, but kept for a historic site. As we will see, that did not come to pass. How did the bridge get here? The bridge was 8 years old when they decided to build Lake Wissota, as I said last week, so I would have a lake to water ski on growing up. They used the ice in the winter to support the dismantling. I showed a photo last week of using 12 by 12 timbers to support it up above the ice. No heavy equipment back in those days. And I talked about the giant director set concept with these pins they had to pull out and take it apart. There was also the unconventional installation up at Cobban. Again, the ice and the wood cribbing. They built a homemade winch on the side of the river. They buried a log under the ground to secure the winch, ran a cable across the river, and a blind horse all day long for many days, many weeks, months, went round and around and around and stepped over the cable as he turned this large winch. And the bridge moved 1/8 of an inch, being pulled across the river for each time the horse walked around in the circle. Major rehabilitation took place in 1996. All the concrete supporting it on both sides of the river, including the concrete in the middle of the river, which they call the pier. On the edges of the river, it's called the abutments. The floor beams are the horizontal metal steel I-beams that run crosswise to the direction of travel. Some of those were replaced because of deterioration, and an entire new deck. The 4x4s were replaced by 2x4s, many of them, thousands. There's a name missing in here. His name is Tom McCarthy in 1996 from Wisconsin DOT said, we listened to our customers when they did the rehabilitation in 1996. The deterioration continued, and primarily, or at least substantially, the west approach onto Highway 178, State Highway 178, is a very short approach coming off the river before you get to the stop sign, and it's steep. So in order to minimize the risk of accidents, whenever there's any snow in the winter, a salt truck backs up onto the bridge and sprays salt on the bridge and on the entire approach. The bad news is, in the spring of each year, no one came and cleaned the bridge and washed all the salt off. So in the sun, it stayed there all summer to deteriorate the metal to get to the condition we are today. This is the very end of the bridge, right where it joins that steep approach. And if you look, you can see how it is deteriorated. Both the wood, the beams, the floor, all deteriorated. This is the side of the bridge, the underside all rusted and deteriorated. More of the same, so much rust that some of the rivets have fallen out. This is what they call a bearing pad. There's on each one of the spans, all of the weight of the bridge is supported only by 4 of these bearing pads. Severely rusted, very poor condition, which in fact is the reason they concluded it was beyond repair. So the rehabilitation back in 1996 was $668,000. If you were to roll that forward to 2018, it'd be $1.2 million using inflation and things. If the engineers reported in these public meetings that if in fact next year they were going to rehabilitate it for a pedestrian walk bridge, it would cost $13 million. Now, when you ask the question, why so much? The answer the public was given was to build or rehabilitate a bridge and strengthen it to support pedestrians has to be many times stronger than for automobile or truck traffic. That's because in theory, it's the way government operates. There might be a marathon someday that goes across there, and there could be thousands of people on that bridge at one time. $13 million. Therefore, it made sense to destroy it. The decision to replace it, it was closed to all users, bicycles, pedestrians, cars, and trucks in 2017. The county board approved the replacement the same year. Not all of the board was in favor necessarily of even building a new bridge. However, after the highway commissioner explained to the county board that if in fact we didn't build a new bridge and get reimbursement from the state for both the new bridge and the demolition of the old bridge, the county would have to pay back the $500,000 in engineering fees for all the long-term study to find the ideal location. It was a pretty easy decision. We're going to build a new bridge. No mention at all at that meeting of preservation, none whatsoever, not a hint. And there was the long-term concept in Wisconsin, and as most other states, that the local government entity pays 20% and the state, sometimes using federal money, but through the state, pays 80% of new highways, new replacement highways, replacement bridges, that kind of thing. However, when we started to hear some years ago about improving the infrastructure of the US, the Wisconsin Department of Transportation said, great, we will do that. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to replace more bridges, but we're going to spend less money on each bridge. The new policy is called replace in kind. That's why the new bridge has to go right where it is today, because it's the shortest distance across the river, because back in 1917, the bridge wasn't long enough and the locals created a peninsula so the crossing would be short enough to accommodate the bridge. They moved up from now Lake Wissota. That brings us to a historic structure, a bridge. The National Historic Preservation Act, spelled incorrectly, by the way, I apologize, was enacted many years ago. It is under the US Department of Interior and the National Park Service. And when any federal agency or federal money is involved, there's a formal process that has to be used to try to determine how they're going to mitigate the loss to the public because of either damage or complete destruction of a historic structure. That is referred to as Section 106, and the public is supposed to have full participation in the process for this mitigation investigation. Over here, I say it is the National Park Service that implements the NHPA, but in each state, there is something called SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, which really acts as the state surrogate for the National Park Service. In Wisconsin, their office happens to be in the Wisconsin Historical Society building and museum and library in Madison. So the public involvement, there are stakeholders, people that are interested, meaning local landowners, people who use the structure, interested parties in general. And then there are consulting parties. Those are supposedly knowledgeable people with a real vested interest in this bridge. And there are consulting meetings. These meetings are to solicit input from the public of ways that they could minimize the loss or at least mitigate the loss of the work, of the proposed work. The end result is a memorandum of understanding. Sorry about that. Memorandum of, I've got this wrong. Memorandum of agreement. My mistake again. It's amazing what I mess up here. It's referred to as an MOA. I used to work in the legal field and we had memorandums of understanding all the time. My mistake. So there was some farmland across Highway 178 from this bridge. And the plan was, a proposed idea was, at one of these meetings, let's build a roadside park. Let's take one of the two spans and move it across into the cornfield, not unlike the movie Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. Because hundreds of people over the years, groups, weddings, class reunions, family reunions, other kinds of things have used this bridge as background. That bridge is much shorter than the actual span, but I created this rendering, if you will, to show that it would never fit at the current historic marker, just a few hundred yards south of the bridge. However, the farmers who own that land were willing to donate some land, and we could create this site with the entire one span there, and people could exit Highway 178, drive slowly across the bridge, read placards about how the bridge came to be in Cobban, and view the river, come back off the bridge, get on the highway, and continue their trip. That was the plan. That was the plan of Cobban Bridge Preservation, Inc. We created a Wisconsin corporation. We applied for and received IRS 501c3 nonprofit status, meaning anyone who contributed to this effort through a donation would be tax deductible. Unlike the way attorneys do things and law firms, this corporation and IRS status was all done sitting in a recliner, the same recliner that I'm talking to you from right now, 45 minutes of effort. And we had an official company that could, we never have, but could solicit donations, and they would be tax deductible to the giver. The team was made up of myself. I was the founder and I'm the current president. Don Lowe has an engineering firm locally here who works on bridges and concrete abutments and things. Joe Paul Skill has a cabin right near the bridge on Highway K, and he is a retired Wisconsin DOT bridge inspector. Phil Paquette has a firm, a welding and fabrication company in the industrial area on First Avenue in Chippewa Falls. And Jeannie Hanley is the company secretary and treasurer and a retired college professor, I guess, or in administrations. We contacted the Wisconsin National Guard and they were more than happy to help. Out here across from what I call the colony, the northern center, the state home, whatever you call it out here. Across the road is the armory, if you will, for the Wisconsin National Guard. And they have, their function is engineering. This would be a training opportunity for excavation, concrete, moving things. They were willing to help. It would be community service projects, and the Guard has a formal name for this, but no cost to this is our nonprofit organization. And in fact, the Iowa National Guard helped move a bridge in Iowa to its new location using a helicopter, lifted it and moved it into position. Common things that the National Guard does doing community projects for training. So it was going to be a do-over. It was moved once before, but we needed thicker ice because now we have more flow and we have water levels that go up and down based on electric needs. So the Cornell Dam allows more water to come down the river from morning till noon till night. And the ice is not nearly of as good a quality as it was back at the early part of the century. So the people up in the Northwest Territories in Canada, they build highways out on rivers and lakes all the time. And we contacted them. They were more than willing to help. They saw the value of preserving a historic structure, and they were going to come down at not minimal, but nominal cost and create as many inches more of ice than we needed. And there was an engineering firm in Minnesota that had expertise in this, and they were going to tell us how much ice we needed based on the weather and ice formation characteristics of that particular year. Rather than using multiple columns of cribbing, as was done in the early part of the century, this time we were going to put train track out on the ice and across the highway out into the cornfield. And rather than a horse and a cable, there was still going to be a cable, but it was going to be a tow truck that was going to pull this off the river and across the road. And then once it was there, the local house movers would actually pick it up, roll it down the highway, less than an eighth of a mile, and position it up onto the donated land. This is the kind of pump. It is you drill a hole in the ice for ice fishing, put the suction tube down in there. It's a Honda engine, and they can create a couple of inches of ice per hour of water. They have to let it freeze. Then they put another inch or two of water on top and let it freeze. And in just a few nights, you can create another foot of ice. High quality ice. To show you how much ice they create up in the Northwest Territories, that's an ice auger for digging a hole or boring a hole. You can see how tall it is. So these people can create a lot of ice. The engineers in Minnesota just had to determine how much, and they would create it. No big deal. The sand companies have their own railroad track, and they had surplus rail. Rail cannot be disposed of in a scrapyard. It's illegal, but they can donate it to Cobban Bridge Preservation, which they did. And we put it in a barn in Tilden. We built a portion of the metal cribbing, and we used jersey barriers, which are used along highways during construction zones. And those 9 pieces of concrete there represent the weight of one corner of the 4 corners of one span of the bridge. So there were going to be 2 sets of railroad tracks on the ice and 2 sets of railroad tracks across the highway. And that was the equivalent weight of each corner of one span. What we found was it was very difficult to move, could not budget. However, after we put grease, we jacked it up, we put grease on the track, my golf cart and the batteries in my golf cart, turning that little boat winch, we were able to slide one corner of the bridge on train track. It was that easy. And you can see the grease we put there. And we could move it much, much faster than what the horse did 100 years ago. And this was the tow truck that was going to back up to the bridge, lift the edge of the bridge, the one end of the bridge up, and a fork truck was going to put the railroad track under it, set it back down. This tow truck was going to go out into the cornfield in the wintertime, secure itself to the frozen ground, attach those cables, and slide it off the river. That is an illustration of what we were planning to use to slide on the train track. There would be 2 of those out on the far end, the center of the river. We would lift that bridge out there, or excuse me, that span end of it out there, and then slide these 2 under the bearing pads that I showed you. And these 2 would slide, they'd be secured to the bridge, then and greased on the bottom. and these two columns would slide until it got to shore. Rather straightforward, doing essentially what the farmers did 100 years ago. We visited many other bridges, nearly a dozen in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois. Talked to the people who did it, learned a tremendous amount, and we were convinced, and an engineering company I'll talk about in a minute was convinced this can be done again. However, common logic, common theory of bridge engineers these days, the only way you can move a bridge is with a crane. And it would take two huge cranes, one on the ice, one on shore. That's the only way they could see it being done. Chippewa County, as much as they would say they were supportive, they hoped we would succeed. In fact, were almost of no help to us. In fact, the word was on the street that we should not, no one should help us. So all companies in Wisconsin declined our request for contracts to help. That's the preservation people to help us, advise us with this Department of Interior Section 106 rights that we had to explore this. Bridge engineering, bridge contractors who build bridges and move bridges. We ended up going out of state for all of our people that would commit to helping us with this project. The legislators, we visited them in Madison, both the state level and the federal level. We had a plastic trestle from a train set that we took with us, created tremendous conversation. They were all very supportive, excellent communications, and we ultimately had a letter of support from all six, and we created a booklet that we distributed back to them and to anybody that would listen. I mentioned earlier the memorandum of agreement. I have it written correctly here. It was an agreement between Wisconsin Department of Transportation and the State Historical Preservation Office. At the first consultation meeting, the consulting preservationist had a couple of recommendations of things just to kick off the discussion. We could take some photos and send them to the Library of Congress, and we could make a larger historic marker a few hundred yards south of the bridge. Well, the public had other ideas. You know, a couple of dozen ideas came up and were expressed. And Cobban Bridge Preservation raised our hand and said, we'd like to move the bridge. There was silence in the room for a bit until someone caught their breath, and we began to discuss that. So what they concluded was the memorandum of agreement would contain a section to market the bridge. None of the other public provided ideas apparently were given serious consideration, because during the writing of the document, none of the other stakeholders or consulting parties were contacted for more details. Just the original two that the consultant laid out at the very beginning of the first meeting. And because that process took so long and we needed to use winter and the ice for support, we lost one of our winters. But finally, there was an announcement last fall for giving away the bridge with conditions. There were the original requirements, But then there were some new announced requirements. And again, because of the bureaucracy and the time for the competitive bidding process, which also prevented us from teaming up with other interested parties because it was all kept secret. More opportunity was lost, and the second winter was lost for us to do it, to move it, relocate it. The original requirements were we wanted to move a single span, just the metal. We understood from the county it had to be finished by June 30th of this year. And we would be reimbursed based on the estimated demolition costs. We would be reimbursed at the time the contract was awarded to build the new bridge. We were fine with that. We knew that, or we were quite hopeful anyway, and had indications that the contractors were sympathetic to this project and they would wait for their money until the contract was awarded. It was doable. However, over time, the engineering estimates continued to decline to a relatively small number. However, we didn't give up. We didn't call uncle or say uncle. We continued. And it got to be a rather small number, but still, in our opinion, we weren't going to be able to build the park. We weren't going to be able to make it the way we thought. We still would have enough funds to, in fact, move the bridge off and preserve it. And we could do fundraising thereafter to refurbish it, build the park, and other things. However, the announced requirements were, it was mandatory now that we move both spans, not just one. Not only did we have to move both spans, we had to absolutely refurbish them, both spans, to the National Historic Preservation Act standards. Major bureaucracy. The timeline remained the same, but in addition, we had to remove all the concrete from both shores and from under the water. And then, after the new bridge was completed, a committee would be formed to determine if moving both spans and removing all the concrete really, in fact, did save the project any money. And they told us flat out, there might not be any savings. We interpret that to mean if the project had overruns, there would be no savings. We chose CBPI, Cobban Bridge Preservation, Inc. We chose to propose under the original set of requirements. We spent 2 years doing the research, the experimentation, the planning based on those requirements as we knew them. The rules changed, but we chose to propose based on the original requirements and said, just reimburse us 80% of the engineering estimates for demolition. Therefore, the taxpayers save as well. They rejected it, our proposal, but said we could amend it. We amended it, and they ultimately gave us the final decree that we were not qualified to do it. It needs to be cranes. It can't be the way it was done before. It was no risk to anybody. We had a local recycle company, scrap dealer, that had guaranteed us a recovery plan, and they would purchase and provide to the county and the state a performance bond to guarantee that if anything went wrong, if it fell on the ice, it fell through the ice, whatever happened, it would be recovered, cleaned up, the DNR would be satisfied, and the new construction could begin on time. Didn't seem to motivate anybody to think about our proposal. Take serious consideration of our proposal. One of our mistakes probably was to not get the media involved. Ultimately, the newspapers you've seen have done stories, both Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls, and Cornell, both television stations, as well as social media, publicized our efforts. There was the Facebook page called Save the Cobban Bridge. But in reality, what that was is Save the Cobban Crossing. That effort, that publicity was, we need to be able to get across the bridge into Chippewa Falls. It wasn't so much the preservation of a piece of history. We probably should have gotten the media involved earlier. I had been advised by a person in Montana who went down a similar road, moving a bridge like we did. He said, get them involved early and frequently. We chose to remain low key, not to irritate the powers that be. And ultimately, I think that was a bad decision, primarily on my part, for advocating that. In retrospect, every one of the other successful projects that we came across was a partnership between some government agency and a private, either nonprofit company or the public. Ours was a competitive process. As I mentioned earlier, we could not learn of the government agency up near Superior, who would have liked to have had one span to go across a short waterway onto a park area up there to make the drive to the park much shorter. And just in general, there was poor communications because of the formal arm's length relationship with DOT and Chippewa. So there's still a Hail Mary pass. I remember that term. I don't watch much football, but I remember that term back in the Vince Lombardi and Bart Starr days of the Packers. I'm not going to talk at all about that, classified and confidential. Very, very small chance or possibility of success, but we can't rule it out. Stay tuned over the next year. Today was very exciting. I learned of a technology called laser scanning, which they can take an object and create a computer file to make it look exactly like if it had been designed and drawn using modern CAD/CAM system. I learned of this through a newspaper article over in Merrill, Wisconsin, contacted these people at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. They were here to visit us. We talked. 3 people came up here today, arrived at 6:30, spent until 4:30, used a scanner sitting on tripod, which they moved around. Also flew a drone for a couple of hours up, over and around and under the bridge to scan it. And they will deliver to us a 3-dimensional model, which at some point we will be able to put on display somewhere where you'll be able to look at the top, the sides, the bottom, even walk through the bridge. Very exciting day. This is a photograph of the drone with the operator standing on the end of the bridge. This is one of the initial scans. It looks to me like I'm a real fan of Ansel Adams and black and white photographs, but this is what will become the source of the CAD/CAM like data. We have installed a rest in peace historic marker on the donated property, just a few hundred, less than 1/8 of a mile south on 178 Cobban Road. I think it is 160th Street. I'm not sure, but it's Cobban Road that intersects with the river. We have a marker there that looks like a historic marker, but enough different that it won't give anybody the illusion that the state of Wisconsin put it there. It's temporary. It's current authorization only allowed to be there until the old bridge is demolished and taken away. But we're hoping to get authorization to leave it there permanently. And that is what it looks like before the corn grows up today, this summer behind it. There's a rock underneath it that was already there. We put the sign around it, the marker around it. And this week, that rock is going to get painted white, so it catches your attention as you drive. It's close enough to the road. You can simply pull off on the shoulder, look out your window and read it. And this is what it says. And essentially tells the story of why it did not get preserved and was to be demolished. So at the last session a week ago, I talked about a little micro book of how the bridge arrived from now Lake Wissota up at Cobban. It was only 15 pages or so, as I recall. Now for this session, there is a mini book, considerably larger, about 60 pages, that essentially describes in some considerable detail what I just went through here. And it's again free to anybody who wants it. Either email me, call me, or text me at this number at the bottom here. And I'll be happy to forward to you immediately. And I believe that is my last slide. So that is my information. Is there any questions from anyone? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn on my video and put my glasses back on. Is there any questions about anything I presented? If not, thank you very much for watching. And if you desire a copy, just contact me. I'll be happy to provide it. And again, thank you to Howard and the Chippewa Falls Public Library for publicizing this and being the meeting host, so I didn't have to think about those administrative duties. Thank you, Howard.
No problem. Thank you for doing this, Chuck, and thanks to everybody who attended this evening.
Have a good night.